In this presentation, I want to bring together some ideas that I've been working on for almost 20 years in trying to understand, maybe I'd phrase it as the communication of information about how social change can occur through studies in law, given the existence of racial injustice. Another way I might say that is folks tend to look at law as an ideal, whether that be moral, religious, or ethically based. But in the lived experiences of individuals, particularly those of black and brown bodies, law has not been an ideal. It has been a tool for domination. And so when we consider the idea of racial politics and then policing and corrections as a predictable outgrowth of racial politics, I want to present what I'd call a brief accounting of criminal justice, meaning that there should be some way of making sense of the level of violence over time, as well as the messaging that is occurring as that violence is being challenged in protests and in social media. So I wanted to start with some vocabulary. So by racial politics, I mean the use of the unfounded scientific and religious fiction that one group of humans is superior to another as a means of maintaining dominance. And I'm really focused there on the use of this fiction to maintain dominance. So I don't think, it's hard to place this in this exact moment, largely because we have so much information at our disposal. So there's certainly places on the internet and in social media where we can find very belligerent, clearly racist propaganda, but there's also within the news and in entertainment very subtle racist propaganda. So we want to try to identify what the myth is that folks use that claim that one group of people is superior to another, partly to demystify that claim, to pull out the lack of scientific basis and the contradictory religious statement that one group of people is better than another, but also to figure out how to manipulate and in some ways measure the possibility of change within that communicative environment. In other words, within a place where both of these claims, both the direct and the subtle claims to superiority are occurring, how does one navigate and maneuver within that space, whether that's a room or whether it's a social, kind of internet space. It could also be the space within, right, our minds, right, whether that's a process that occurs within a group like a classroom or the workplace, or more and more, right, the street, as the protests and even just, again, going back to lived experiences, modern policing is so much more now beyond just the home, beyond our own activities, and more influencing the way we think about the world. So in transitioning by policing, I mean the historic claim, right, by governments, what we call the state in the science of politics, to claim that violence is legitimate. In other words, the state, the government, claims that their use of violence is quote-unquote right. And that's what we consider to be policing within the Western tradition. Then there's the necessary outgrowth of policing, right? So if you get to use violence as legitimate, the ultimate act of violence is, of course, death. But you could also injure someone or even just threaten to kill them. And in that case, you'll need some way of either rehabilitating that person, right? So some kind of prison hospital, or you will need to secure them some way, right? Until you decide as a state what you're going to do with those people that you've deemed to be enemies of the state. So this is not, these two ideas, policing and corrections, were not new to the United States, obviously. And several researchers have done a lot of uncovering of the origins of policing corrections as it occurred during the Middle Ages in continental Europe. And that was somewhat different than the institutions in England. So I think what you're seeing in the United States, at least since the 1960s, is kind of an integration of those two systems of medieval continental Europe and the old English traditions. The English traditions were focused more on judges and the jury system and community punishment, whereas the Napoleonic, when Napoleon kind of perfected this state of surveillance, whereby individuals would, tattle on each other or rat on each other, and then the state would intervene in those conflicts. So you see kind of that forming together in the United States. And then I think the purpose of doing a study like this, and again, I intend this to be kind of the last thing that you watch, although it wouldn't necessarily matter if this is not a new subject to you, in your study of racial injustice. I want to come up with an accounting of the criminal justice system. So that would be a method or a system of reporting and documenting what are called governmentalities, which are the instruments that the government uses to enforce the law as it sees fit, to use violence and surveillance, and then to analyze, verify, and report those results, right? So what do we find when we do an accounting of criminal justice? So I want to start with, what would be called kind of basic political theory, or what one should learn in their intro to government class, if you haven't already. But the idea is what is the problem with this, right? Why not just let the police do whatever they want? And what you'll always hear, right, is something like, well, if you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't worry, which is an old totalitarian statement, which was popular during the Stalin regime. So it is somewhat surprising that is so often used as a defense in the United States, considering that, for 150 years, that was, you'd be in a lot of trouble if you said something like that with your peers, and you'd certainly be looked down upon as being someone who didn't believe in individual liberty. So it's just strange that has taken over if you study American history. If we're just looking at the situation without thinking about the history of the West and liberty in particular, then I suppose it isn't very strange. And I think these two pictures speak loudly. Like one is from the civil rights movement. If I remember correctly, this is from Alabama, in the protests of the right to work. And you see the slogan here in the bottom picture, where folks are marching saying, "I am a man," right? In other words, I am declaring that I am equal, or I am human, and you are not in any scientific way or religious way superior. However, if you see to the left here, we've got the police, pointing their guns at these individuals. This is a clear, unequal power relationship. One human has a sign, and the other human has a gun. I think it's worth thinking for a second, if you wanted to pause, just what is the danger? What is the threat, right? Because you can see in the background, if you look carefully, there are tanks. So on one side you have tanks, on the other side you have guns. What is the fear that the state has, and why is it threatening to use violence when men line up in a row holding a sign? And I think that will at least help you to start thinking about, this is not the first time that these fears have existed, right? So the idea that somehow riots will ensue, or that looters will exist, comes present into the police, into the state's mind, when men line up in a row and declare their independence, or they declare their right to exist, or even their humanity. So just something to kind of think about as we go through this presentation. And then I want to, frame the conversation within this time that we're in, right? And so you see breaking news, right? The news report here says, and this is the subtle racism, U.S. President expected to comment on the recent unrest, right? And you'll hear that civic unrest, civic strife, civil disobedience, and quote-unquote lawlessness. There's a Ben Harper song that's in my mind right now that says, don't tell me I can't break the law because the law has broken me. Another side of this is a Beatles song where it's, happiness is a warm gun. The idea here is that one person's point of view of what is civil, what is law, what is lawless, or what is unrest is not universal. That is not an objective statement. So we need to think about a multiple point of view approach when we think about what is law. What would civil rest, is a strange word, unrest, right? So civil rest, what would peace and calm in a civil society look like? And if it were attainable, and I do think it is, and I think it is often attainable, what would the police be needed for, right? Why would you need police if there was no division, if there was no civil strife? I say that because in Terry versus Ohio, the case from 1968, so put that in perspective, right? This case is, the Supreme Court is dealing with this policing power case at the same time that there are civil rights protests going on. So this is clearly a reaction by the government, by the state, through the judicial branch to quote-unquote restore order, which is the language you're hearing, which is subtle racism, that if brown and black folks are to declare their independence or declare rights or to declare their humanity, that somehow is a threat to white dominance. I don't think it necessarily is, but I can see the argument that people are making, that they feel that way. And so Justice Douglas in that case was the only person who dissented and said this: to give the police greater power than a magistrate is to take a long step down the totalitarian path. Perhaps such a step is desirable to cope with modern forms of lawlessness, but if it is taken, it should be deliberate choice of the people through a constitutional amendment. Again, I'm interpreting, but I interpret this to be racist. He seems to be warning white folks that, or at least the dominant group that's voting in 1968, which is white men, that if they're going to become a totalitarian government and take away liberty, then white men should make this choice in some kind of deliberate way. And he's suggesting through a constitutional amendment so that it goes through the traditional patterns of government. So it goes through what's typically called liberal democracy, that it's debated, that it goes through all 50 states, or 2/3 of the House and Senate vote on this, and that it gets enshrined in the Constitution. That is, of course, did not happen. This step towards, big step towards totalitarianism by white men was taken in a Supreme Court case where they had said that you have to look at the totality of the circumstances, which is an interesting phrase because that's not what happened in that case. And this is where I want us to emphasize the subtlety of racism since I think at least the 1930s to the 1950s. And that's really the totalitarian system that we're in. I think that's self-evident in this next slide. But I think where it becomes subtle or difficult to confront is when someone says, yeah, but what did he do? And in this particular case, I'm referencing Trayvon Martin, who, when I've brought Trayvon Martin up as an example, and I wonder if the organizers of Black Lives Matter have also experienced this since the Trayvon Martin incident, or murder, I should say. I am often asked, but what did Trayvon Martin do? I think, that goes back to the subtlety of racism within American politics. If you don't know what happened in the Trayvon Martin case, you obviously don't need to know. It is not something that threatens your daily existence. And most often I hear it from white folks. And that's troubling. Right? It's a troubling question in that it's problematic. It means that you're so far removed from this movement, from the defund the police movement, the Black Lives Matters movement, that you can participate in politics and yet have almost no knowledge about the subject matter. I'm not saying that you must know about the Trayvon Martin incident, this murder. I think there could be a few reasons why it might not. You could be a recent immigrant, for example. It's hard to get good information, right? So unless you've sought out information about policing, it could be difficult to find out. It could be the same fact as the Ferguson situation or Eric Gardner, I think. It's many others, right? So I think that's the troubling situation that we're in, is that a lot of people have opinions, but they're not basing those opinions on the tragic realities that other people have to go through. And that's what I mean by a multiple point of view perspective, or a totality of the circumstances approach, is often really just one perspective, that of either the police and or of the white dominant majority. So we should think about this idea of why would shooting an unarmed human be moral under any circumstances? In other words, what could an unarmed human do that would be so threatening and imminent to present a danger, a clear and present danger, to someone who is heavily armed? There is no correct answer there, right? It's never moral. But you can bend over backwards and come up with all sorts of rationalizations as to why you believe it should be moral. And that's the trouble, right? So what does this say about the legitimacy of the law? Well, the law, in order to be totalitarian, needs violence, whereas the law, in order to be persuasive, needs reason. So using violence is obviously easier than using reason or persuading someone. And I think the problem is that we all have something to hide, the most obvious being your bank account information. And yet, people say this all the time, well, you have nothing to hide, then don't worry about it. The problem is like beauty, evil lies in the eye of the beholder. Someone can easily make something up about you. During the early years after the passing of the Patriot Act, enough people were accused of crimes that they didn't commit, were not given access to lawyers, and were taken out of the country to be tortured, that the Senate had to have hearings on this and then pass new rules to try to restrict this behavior. And even Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld himself said, the United States doesn't do torture, after it became clear that the United States was torturing people in Iraq, specifically the Abu Ghraib prison. And his point was not that we don't do it as in he believed it didn't happen. What he was saying is saying it to his military personnel, we don't torture, stop doing it. And there's a documentary about him where you can hear him explaining that was the last thing he thought would happen. Now, you can judge whether he's telling the truth or not, right, for your own self. But the fact that he had to make that statement indicates that these policing powers, especially under the Patriot Act, went well beyond what Justice Douglas could even imagine in 1968, but proved him right. That first step towards totalitarianism realized itself in those photos of Abu Ghraib. And if you've never seen those, you should certainly look them up. They are, I mean, I'll warn you, they're extremely offensive, and they're disgusting. But try to remember that those people who did those torturous events, right? That was a common tactic at that time to justify what people were saying. If you don't have anything to hide, then you have nothing to worry about. And that certainly was not true. When you're stripped naked, you clearly have nothing to hide, and yet the torture continued. And so I think it's important to think about law within this context. And there's two pictures here I want to further explain. One comes from a book, E.P. Thompson, Whigs and Hunters. And, you know, it comes from England a little bit before the Declaration of Independence in the United States, where there were hunters that were, quote unquote, hunting on what was, you know, always their land from their point of view. And, you know, we're talking about, you know, you go hunt a deer so that you can eat it with your family, right? And you feed your village. But the recent political situation had changed in England, where the king and the government had claimed that those lands were theirs and that no one could hunt on them. And this book documents that there was a deer overpopulation problem, and that the king and the government weren't taking care of this problem. So deer would come into the village. So if you killed that deer, even though you were in the village, you would be violation of the king's law, because the king's law was sovereign, it was supreme. And so you'd be forced to police action and corrections, even for doing something as basic as trying to survive by not starving to death. So these folks started disguising themselves, putting mud on their faces, you know, wearing what we would call camo gear today. And so then the government and the king made that a crime. And so they called them the black face laws, so that if you tried to hide your face, if you had a mask, in other words, you'd be guilty. And this book documents all of the cases of the folks who were punished for violating this law. And again, you can see, like, if you have nothing to hide, then why would you, you know, cover your face? Well, you're starving to death and you want to go eat a deer, but you don't want to get caught, right? So this kind of shows, like, this civil disobedience is a sign of desperation, right? It's a riot is the last thing that a group can do when they feel like they just aren't being paid attention to. And then if you look over to the right, it says, you know, this is a Senate report from the Department of Justice that says the USA Patriot Act sunsets report. Because, you know, what that means is when a law is passed, it usually has what's called a sunset clause, meaning that in 10 years it will no longer be the law. So what happened? How come in 2013 the Patriot Act didn't expire? Well, they renewed it. And this is the problem of the Patriot Act. It was argued that it was emergency powers, that these powers had to be given over to police in order to protect us from Saddam Hussein, if you remember, or, you know, most of you might be too young for that, but you know, we were supposed to be protected by Saddam Hussein. Well, Saddam Hussein is dead. Osama bin Laden is dead. According to Donald Trump, there are basically no terrorists left in the world. So these, like, when you see these pictures of the police that, you know, no longer have a rifle, they now have semi-automatic weapons, you know, riot gear, tanks, bulletproof body armor. You know, this is what AOC means when she says the police have been militarized. And yet that's deeply unconstitutional. It's illegal. and yet people have given away those powers freely. So Justice Douglas, again, was warning about this totalitarian system that we would end up being in, and yet people, by and large, especially white folks, seem to be perfectly okay with it. So there's this difficulty then about, well, what does this movement for defunding the police really mean? And if you go to the Black Lives Matter website, this is prominently displayed there. And it's not about taking money, this is some of the rhetoric, taking money away from police officers so that they're going to starve to death. I mean, I was shocked to find out a childhood friend of mine is a police officer, and he makes nearly $200,000 a year with a high school diploma. And there was a recent news article that's been uncovering that Seattle Police Department officers have been stealing money, essentially. Or, I mean, it's hard to even say steal because nobody's really been paying attention. So one officer patrolman has been making $450,000 a year. This is what we mean by defund the police. There has been a runaway of power that has been reinforced by judges, as Dr. Chapman has made clear in over multiple years, that has legitimized the abuse of power by the police, by the government, now since at least 1968. And so this is what the social media movement is about, is bringing awareness to these abuses of power and understanding that, I think a lot of people forget, the police are publicly funded. These are taxpayer dollars. This is part of the budget, right? So at the same time you're taking money away from education, at the same time your tuition is going up, at the same time there is less money for old folks, for Social Security, retirement, and health care. At the same time there's less money for children. There's more money for the militarization of police. And that is, obviously a problem. But I do want to put this back in perspective, and there's a project I'll be working on with a political philosopher starting today, essentially, which is, what is the probability of social media movements having actual legislative change effects, right? How likely are these to lead to change? It's mixed examples. The right wing has used media politics quite efficiently to get what they want. Even just the words, pro-life, when, in fact they are anti-abortion, right? There's nothing in the pro-life agenda on the political right to support children, right? There's nothing in there saying, here's some, we're so for life that we're going to help every child. And so I think, which is really contradictory from a religious point of view, but they've effectively used the language in the media campaign. The same thing in what's the so-called tort reform movement, largely based on lies and exaggerations. And yet it's been exceedingly effective at invoking legislative change. So, but if we compare that to, say, the Me Too movement, which was very, very popular a couple of years ago in social media, is notably absent, right, in news reporting to this day. And scholars who have done this kind of work, I think, are forgetting that, only a small minority of humans have access to this kind of social media advocacy, right? You have to have a certain amount of money. You have to live in a certain privileged environment. You have to have a certain level of comfort. You have to have enough security to believe that you're not going to be targeted for this advocacy. And then you have to have an internet connection. And so it's not a large number of people when you compare it to the number of victims, whether it be victims of police violence, racism, or sexism and genderism. It doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile. It just means that we need to try to put things in perspective, that this certainly is not going to be enough, that there has to be organizing and legislative lobbying that has to occur in addition to the social media. I just want to kind of remind folks that this is, again, not the first time that we've been in this situation as a country. So I'm going to end this presentation by reminding us of what the historical roots are in slavery and capitalism. But first, I want to just kind of remind us of some of these terms that should be important. And this picture was taken at the climate change march, and I was given permission by police to interview folks. And so they let me in this kind of police area. And as a white male with privilege and educational privilege in particular, you know, I almost appear in this picture as a spectator, right? I get to watch. You know, I was on one side of the fence interviewing folks, and then back on the other side of the fence, you know, getting pictures and interviewing some of the other folks that were behind me, behind another fence. But that space is an odd space, and it's a space that I occupy from time to time, where it almost feels like I'm a quote-unquote neutral observer, but of course I'm not. Humans are agents of change, and they can clearly see me, and their behavior changes just like it changes my behavior. So I want to keep that in mind as we think about governmental systems, right? If a totalitarian administration or an authoritarian or a dictatorship is by far the normal, right, in human history. If you go through and look at the vast majority of systems over the last 10,000 years, they almost always contain a despot, somebody who wants power ruthlessly, who seeks total control over the life of their subjects. They dismantle democratic institutions like higher education, defund it. They defund public health care systems. They manipulate elections or cancel them altogether. They close down or buy media outlets, which is occurring right now. And then they criminalize the opposition, quote unquote, lock her up. You might feel like that's fun, but it's a totalitarian tactic. Again, most famously used during the Stalin regime. I think, and Hitler in Germany. So I think, to celebrate these ideas, and by all means, right, it's a free country, at least for a few more years, so you're allowed to believe these things. You can want to live in a national socialist dictatorship if you'd like, but that is not the history of the country. And the history of the country was based on an ideal of liberal democracy, which is more than majority voting in elections. That's the lowest form of democracy. That's the least one can do. But in theory, it's a complex set of interdependent institutions that both restrain and regulate the governmental instrumental powers through a rule of law and enumerated and implied checks and balances, meaning that there is not just the power in the sense of complying with an order where there are consequences, otherwise known as legitimate violence. There's also the resistance to that legitimate violence, in other words, civil disobedience, which has at least a 2,000-year-old history within what's called the West, right, going back to the Greeks. Again, though, this is an ideal, right? So you can very easily have a form of illiberal democracy that's mostly majority voting and then has components of the totalitarian administration. So I say here, right, we seem to be living in this kind of a hybrid where we like to pretend we have a smiley face about liberal democracy, but in reality, we seem to have majority rules means that if a majority of the people want to live in a dictatorship, then I guess that's what we're going to live in and oppress other groups. And that seems to be almost abundantly obvious. So the question then becomes, if the ancient polis or politics was social consensus in what was called the agora, the public space, as a struggle for power of influence, of persuading people, and then the modern political system, during the quote-unquote Enlightenment, was the distribution of specific enumerated or written down powers through periodic elections, then what is this political situation we're in now with social media? I think the ideal of social media would be something like everyone gets to participate and have a voice. I think the undercurrent, however, seems to be that the loudest and the most violent have the largest presence and are shutting down and threatening other people in a very angry monologue. So we're not really having a dialogue. So social media has not quite created either the ancient polis or the modern political ideal. And I don't know that the agora was ever ideal or that the distribution of powers was ever ideal. So it could be that we're just recreating the same problem through social media. That's where I'd lean towards. That's what we seem to be doing. But I think that there is still some time and analysis that needs to be done before we can judge efficiently or effectively that that's the situation we're in. It feels that way, however. So I want to take a look from the right then, from the conservative right, starting with Barry Goldwater, and really arguing this in the 50s and 60s, that what he argued was that, the awful truth remains that we can establish the domestic conditions for maximizing freedom for white folks along the lines I have indicated and yet become slaves. We can do this by losing the Cold War to the Soviet Union. This is that subtle superiority. We could be as free and great as we want. We could have succeeded in making America great. But if the enemy wins, then we'll lose all that progress. And that's exactly the framework that Donald Trump is using. So I am very much calling out and saying that the emperor has no clothes. There's nothing there. This is a specious or false argument because it always creates an enemy. There's always an enemy then. And so anything you gain, you're suddenly afraid that you're going to lose because there could always be the potential enemy. That means that you're always in a state of war. And that's a choice you're making. So that brings us kind of back to theory, right? Political theory. So Samuel Huntington, a political theorist, said the civilizational us and the extra-civilizational them is a constant in human history. These differences stem from feelings of superiority toward people who are perceived as being very different, fear of and the lack of trust in such people, difficulty of communication with them as a result of those differences, and those differences could be language, culture, and what we otherwise consider behavior or behaving correctly, right? Politeness. A lack of familiarity with the assumptions, motivations, social relationships, and social practices of other people. In other words, ignorance. So ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to the idea of being superior, and then superiority leads to a state of war, which seems to be present in what Goldwater is saying, what Trump is saying. On the other hand, we look at this from another point of view. The ideal of democracy itself, right, only works if people believe they're the same people and they speak quote-unquote the same language. This does not mean in the sense of English. This means in the sense of shared values, shared politics, etc. So once they become divisive, there really isn't an ideal of democracy anymore, right? Suddenly democracy fades away because there is no social consensus. So a more modern historian in the German time during the Nazi regime said, to the state as an essentially political being belongs what's called the juice belly, the right war, right? The real possibility of deciding in a concrete situation who the enemy is and what they should do to fight with them. And, this is the problem. Because as Machiavelli said long ago, war is just when it is necessary. In other words, if I believe that you are evil, then I have the quote-unquote right to kill you rightly. And that's the problem. So if I compare that to racial politics, then under that theory, if white folks during the slave patrols, and what you're seeing in that is 1839, felt like a freed slave or a runaway slave or a free enslaved person was a threat to other white people, then they gave themselves the right to arrest, detain, punish, or kill. And that's the form or the origin of the state's right to violence. So we fast forward into the 1950s and we see it again. If a non-white person has the right to exist, then why are they detained, arrested, punished, etc.? Well, it's because the white group has constructed this fear of the other in which they have the right to use violence when they feel it is necessary. So now we do our accounting. And as you see in the bottom right, I find this fascinating, right? Director Comey at the time said, it's unacceptable that the Guardian newspaper has better data on police violence in the United States. Well, it might be unacceptable, but it is perfectly explainable. If the white power structure does not want to admit that they're doing anything wrong, they are not going to do an accounting. They are not going to analyze what is going on. I think sometimes, the reason why white folks have a hard time understand what is going on or what is happening here is because they choose to be ignorant or willful ignorance. And so when we put these into perspective, when we see that this problem affects black and brown bodies more than it affects white folks, we see that this is a problem of policing within a racial political environment. And so we need to just kind of keep that in the forefront of our mind, that if you want to solve that particular problem, you have to solve policing within the context of a racial political environment. So then how do we analyze this? Well, here are my suggestions, and this is how I'm working towards it. In the next few slides, we'll kind of explain this in detail. The first thing I think, in the conversations that I've had with people I think that are smarter than me, the issue keeps coming back to the myth of individualism. And if you're curious about what does this mean, the myth of individualism, you'll check out the book Habits of the Heart with the last name Bellah, is the author, one of the authors. And you can likely find some YouTube clips on this as well. Again, Habits of the Heart, Bellah, Bellah. And the idea here is not so much that there's a unified or universal myth of individualism in America, but that there are very particular myths of individualism. So this concept of individualism, of the I, that I made it, rags to riches, I mean, you can go on and on and on, is particular to the person and to the culture of which they, kind of their family environment, their work environment, etc. So the problem is complicated because people have varying ideas of what they think an individual is, when in reality, the scientific reality is there is no such thing as an individual, both in the sense that your identity is constantly changing, just like mine, but since, the more literal biological sense that, you, just like me, were a product of your parents, who were a product of their parents, and so on and so on and so on. We are evolutionary creatures. We didn't come out of the middle of nothing, and we certainly didn't make ourselves. And so it's an incredible fiction that has held so much power over people that it's shocking. So I've been thinking about this for several years now, and one philosopher raised the idea that perhaps this is a reaction to a fear of death. Both the literal death, that be it the fact that I'm going to die, I construct this concept of myself as an individual in the hopes that that will live on after I die. After my physical body dies, perhaps there will be some individual soul, individual idea, individual concept, or quote-unquote a legacy. I think there's some merit to that idea. I think that's, probably very likely that that's how people start to construct it. It means that it's very difficult to deconstruct that idea then, because it is not based on any concrete material present. It's based on an unknown future. But I think it also manifests, or it creates itself, in this fear of losing one's culture. At least, if you go back and you see the protests in Charlottesville as they chant, Jews will not replace us, is what I heard and what has been reported. Who is the us there? The only assumption I can make, I think scientifically, is to assume that the people who organized and who were marching and chanting were not Jewish. I don't know that for a fact. All I can look at that then is say, okay, well, that fits that pattern of racial superiority, a fictitious scientific and religious belief that one group of people is superior to another. So that's not an individual in that case. That is individuals coming together, believing that they have freedom in individuality, and then coming together as a group in a very contradictory way, trying to maintain what they believe to be their cultural superiority, and that they perceive a threat from some outside group. And so you see this kind of working itself out leading up to the present situation. So that leads to a very complicated idea of white privilege and what a friend of mine calls the theater of power. And I also think that Judith Butler has talked about this, politics as a theater. I think the idea here is complicated in the sense that from the conversations I have with white folks, when they think about the word privilege, they think about economic privilege in the sense of being exceedingly wealthy. So in order to have quote unquote white privilege, many of them believe that you need to be a multimillionaire. So they don't see the fact that they have a mortgage, a house in the suburbs, a job, a retirement plan, health care, a lot of material possessions, cable, internet, cable and internet, vacations, all these things, children, that they never have to think about whether they're going to be targeted by police, that they get treated with respect when they go to the grocery store, and so on and on and on. They don't see that as privilege. They take it for granted. So when they're contested or when someone pushes back, they go into a state of defensiveness, again, I believe out of fear. However, this fear is theater, it's drama, it's not a legitimate fear, right? There's not an actual threat they're not going to lose any of those things. However, because we live in a finite world, we live here on the earth, and there's only so many resources, and there's only so many ways of kind of meeting the needs of human beings, that I've been asking white folks lately, what are you willing to give up in order for someone else to have what you have? And that's not literal, right? It's not saying that you need to open up your home and let someone live there, although that might not be a bad idea. But you can't take everything, right? You can't continue to accumulate everything if anyone else is going to have something. And so I think this theater of power is an interesting idea because we then think about how is the theater arranged, right? How is the room arranged? Who has access to the front? Who has access to the back? Who's in the audience? Who's up on the stage? Who participates? Who talks? I mean, there's so many questions that can come out of this example of theater. And that would highlight what white privilege is. There's a particular individual, an older white male that I work with, who almost obsessively has to comment on every single question, so that in a 2-hour meeting, he has talked 25 times, and he doesn't seem to realize, care, or acknowledge that no one else talked as much as he did. And he's done this for the 10 years that I've worked with him. I mean, it is, and even bringing it up to him, he takes as a great offense to his quote-unquote individualism as a myth, that somehow, well, I have the right to say whatever I want. Sure, but what are you willing to give up so that someone else has the right to say what they would like? Which in this case is a very low bar. He merely needs to say nothing for 10 minutes. And so there's a in multicultural education, there's a little quote-unquote game that people can play where everyone gets 10 beads. And every time they talk, they put a bead in the middle of the table so that everyone can see who has used all their beads and who hasn't gotten a chance to use any of their beads. Now think about that now in this corona situation, and we're all online. Very difficult, right? And someone could be acting out in ways that are very problematic. And yet it'd be very difficult to show this in a social way. So that brings me to the kind of how ignorance kind of spreads. So I was talking with a colleague recently, and we were talking about the anti-black settling laws as after the emancipation of enslaved peoples. And as folks tried to go west, they thought they were free, but they'd find out, well, you're free, but you can't live here. And so this is startling, of course, when you think that, well, I thought Americans have the right to property. Well, only some Americans have the right to property. And so when you go back in history and you see, well, white males had and white being a very defined thing at that time, in the 1600s and early 1700s, the right to buy and sell property, including other humans, that only applies to the power group, right? And so that makes sense when we think about these power issues today, that this is a evolution of the ongoing kind of dominance and the claim to superiority. So then that leads us to the myth of rights, which comes from an author named Stuart Scheingold and is quite widely used in the field of law and society. And I think what we mean here is that rights are a myth if you don't get to use them. Right? They're not automatic. They don't really apply to everyone equally, and most often they're used by the state. The right to defense, the right to invade another country, etc., in a way that tramples on the rights of other people. So rights is kind of a myth in the sense that it's a constructed fiction. It's not something that is existing like a mountain or a tree. And there's another article that links up to this called Why the Haves Come Out Ahead. Well, why the haves come out ahead is that they have access to the legal system. They know the rules of the game. They are able to pay for lawyers who then, get better and better and better at maintaining their clients' interests. They then participate in the political process. They participate in the drafting of laws. In other words, one group dominates the entire system, and that's why they come out ahead in legal battles, right? It's not so much that your claim is worse, right? You can have a great claim under the law. It can be very clear that you're right and you have a right to win in a case. But if you don't know how to play that game well, then you're going to lose. And so that answers questions like Brown versus Board of Education, Plessy versus Ferguson, Scott versus Sanford. The moral decision does not come out there, but the power decision does, right? The one that the power group is willing to accept. So then this brings me to the obviousness of the history of racism. And this is where the enemy-ally has been structured. And these are through our norms. So these are our laws, right? And then this is an evolutionary process. So cultural products get regenerated from each generation. So these are passed down. So it's not just your DNA that's passed down from family to family, but it's also your racial beliefs. And so that's how racism and white supremacy in particular has gained strength, right? Has become more powerful over time, not less powerful. And then this brings us to the economic base of social relations, the realization that the slave system has, early roots in what we would call racial capitalism. In other words, the right to make a profit based on racism. So in the last few slides here, I just wanted to give you a schematic or a visualization here. On the one hand, right, when you have conflict right there in the middle, you can follow the blue arrow. And let's say that you and I have a conflict and we want to do it in a way that recognizes our equality. Well, in this country, we'd first look to see, is there a legal remedy? And then if there is a legal remedy, we'd construct a community where we'd start to work on mediating and negotiating these rights within our groups, whether we see that as a political group or a religious group, etc. Then we'd kind of think about it individually, right? We'd say, okay, so I have the right to vote, I have the right to self-defense, I have these individual rights, but how do they negotiate with the community of rights? And then we'd start to say, well, what do we mean by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And this is where we'd come to an agreement of, well, what are the basic universal needs of humans, and what should our rights be that we're willing to kind of tolerate? And so you might think of like, well, that you shouldn't kill other people. And this would be a process that we'd kind of come to through conflict resolution. And if you're really interested in this and you think this is a good way of mediating or resolving conflicts, then you'll want to search restorative justice, which is not just about recognizing rights. That's important to recognize people's equality and their human rights, but it's also about restoring their economic position, their social position, and allowing them to engage in the negotiation with the person who violated their rights in a controlled, kind of structured environment. Now, on the other hand, if we follow the red arrow, which represents blood and violence, you see that right off the bat, right? If I see that there is no reason to engage in a legal process with you, and I'd rather resolve my conflict with violence and war, then I will quickly divide into parties. We will not have a sense of justice. We'll have divided justice. And this is what, rationalizes the idea of slavery, that I have the right to dominion over property that I have won through war. And then this is subtle, but it leads to this idea of, well, that means I have the right of discovery, that I have the right over what is called jurisdiction. I have sovereignty over others, that I have, dominance and superiority. And this is then a particular recognition of exclusion. This is not seeking to create an environment in which we're equal. This is seeking to create an environment in which we are very clearly unequal because I have made us that way. So then what's the solution? How do we change this? Well, I think, Patricia Hill Collins, I think, really puts this well. Social structures such as neighborhoods, schools, jobs, religious institutions, recreational facilities, and physical and cyberspace marketplaces, including the social media movements, are the institutional expressions of social inequalities of race, class, gender, age, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and ability. In other words, we see them there, right? We see these reproductions. And so those are the places where we have to have dialogue about those power relations if we ever want to have any kind of a change. So you can't have social change, nonviolent social change, without dialogue. You have to have some dialogue, including with folks that don't want to have that dialogue. So I want to just provide some examples here of what that looks like. And I think you can see this throughout history. These are people who are, let's be honest, right? They're risking their lives in order to simply have a conversation about how to co-create equal social structures. And so, again, this is not going to occur outside of our reality. It's going to occur within these spaces where domination and oppression occur. So I've tried to construct then a model here that would kind of show how this would have to exist, right? So this is our physical space, and what we'd have to do is somehow organize interventions within this physical space. So we start with the economic base of relations. If we had a different economic base of relations, we'd have different kind of pieces within this structure. But as it is, as we exist now, we have a patriarch of capitalism, which is based on two concepts of racist superiority, which largely draws its support, at least in the way that people talk about it, through religion. And I think it's obvious today, but Frederick Douglass was able to capture this in his autobiography, in his other writings, long ago, long before there was social media or even media as we know it. Now it's widely evident, although subtle in most forms in social media. And so that's that first environment. We can talk about defunding the police, BLM, Me Too. We can challenge this racial capitalism. But we have to understand that it's going to be mediated between those two groups. So we have to constantly think about how do we engage a theater of dialogue given these positions, and I think start to think about fear or phobia as the predominant motivation for people. So we have to think about how do you address confronting fear with wisdom and without guilt, not feeling guilty about the fact that people who are being bigoted or willfully ignorant are going to, they're not going to be in a pleasant situation when they're confronted with these inequalities, inequities, and contradictions. And then we need to think about law as being constitutive as opposed to just being about rules or, especially unfair rules, unjust rules, and racist rules. So there's three levels that you should be thinking about in this class. The institution of law, spaces in which we negotiate what the laws should be, like courts, or even just like, again, the theater or the room, right, in which people are talking about the law. The ideologies of law, whether that's the myth of rights, whether it's the myth of individualism, whether it's the idea that law is a tool that can be used for different social groups for different reasons, your different ideas about justice, right? These are all ideas we have about what the law is. And then finally, instrumentalities or governmentalities, right? The tools in which we can invoke the idea of law, whether that's legislation, whether that's a litigation or a lawsuit, or whether that's something called a nomos, the construct of an alternative reality, right? What the world could be, a vision of what we could do, or change, right? Social change. So those three things are not separate from each other. They're always working and interdependent with each other, and that's what we mean by law is constitutive, the fact that these things work with each other. Sometimes they can work negatively, as in white supremacy, and other times they can work in a very liberal way, in a way that allows people to have a dialogue with one another on equal footing. But then we need to think about the limitations and constraints that we, as humans, right here on Earth, have to think about. So the first one I want you to think about is ecological and biological. And these are pretty obvious, but within climate change, right, people are unequal based on how they're affected by such things as climate, weather patterns, hurricanes, volcanoes, fires, etc. Not people are not equal in their effects, right? So not everyone was harmed during the wildfires on the West Coast. Not everyone was harmed in hurricanes. But if you do your research and you do your accounting, you'll find that people of color in America are almost always harmed, whereas folks with white privilege are almost never harmed. And so that's just, right, that's a reality and a constraint that we have to think about and address. The next one I think would be technological. And I've already kind of explained this, right? So social media is one tool that can be used, but it's a limited tool. It's restrained by who has access to it, who's going to be punished if they do use it, and how is it largely used, right? Social media is not largely used for social change. It's largely used as a vanity piece or a very distorted kind of mirror. And then, the cultural limitations. We have language limitations. We have difficulties understanding each other and even just the use of our language. There's legal language, but there's also aspects of entertainment, aspects of religion, aspects of participation and expectations, and just who gets to have these conversations are more cultural than anything else. And then I put just kind of the things that get affected by what would be called the distribution of role power. And so, you have to consider each of these positions, and you're clearly doing that in this injustice research. And I think all of these things are always happening at the same time. That's why they're all in this kind of yellow space. And so these are the things you have to think about if you're looking for social change, and you'll be thinking about them with me and a lot of other people, right? A growing number of people who are concerned about these things. So I'll apologize that this is a fairly long presentation, but it's a lot of information. And again, it's a project I've been working on for nearly 20 years. And I'll thank you for listening and for continuing this important work.